Take off that Medal of Honor right now. This courtroom is not a place for you to defame with cheap jewelry. The judge slammed his gavel loudly, pointing his finger straight at me. Down in the gallery, Janet, my sister, was smiling in satisfaction. They had just conspired to strip me of my inheritance using a forged medical record. Stealing my assets was one thing, but now they wanted to trample on the sacrifices of my fallen comrades for this glory. I didn't struggle, nor did I shed a single tear. When the burly guard aggressively lunged forward, his rough hands ready to rip the sacred silk ribbon from my chest, I simply maintained a cold silence for exactly 3 seconds and responded with one single sentence. And just 3 minutes later, my sister's smile vanished, her face turning pale as the oak doors burst open and a powerful 4-star Admiral stormed in with a squad of military police. Before I tell you what happened, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel if this story resonates with you. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is where you are. The heavy, suffocating scent of cheap oak and synthetic floor wax in that courtroom dragged my memory backward by force. It ripped straight through the walls I had spent decades building inside my skull. That smell was identical to the polished mahogany dining table of my childhood home, the table where my younger sister first learned to destroy me. We grew up in a sprawling colonial house in Virginia that my father bought with his construction empire money. From the outside, it looked like the American dream. White columns, manicured lawn, 2 cars in the driveway. From the inside, it was a psychological minefield rigged by a 35-year-old woman who never held a job in her life. Whenever my younger sister Janet broke a rule, shattered an expensive heirloom, or flat out stole my belongings, she would squeeze out perfectly timed tears on command. She would hyperventilate, clutch her chest like she was the one under attack. My parents, blinded by her fragile little act, would rush to comfort her every single time. They never waited for my side of the story. They just turned their fury onto me. I learned before I turned 10 that the truth meant nothing in our house. The only thing that mattered was who could put on the better performance. While Janet sobbed into my mother's shoulder, she would peek at me through the curtain of her hair and flash a wicked, knowing smirk, a silent declaration of war. I never cried back. I gripped the edge of that dining table until my knuckles turned white, swallowing every ounce of injustice. That bitterness eventually forged my permanent intolerance for liars and manipulators. I poured my entire soul into academics and physical discipline, believing that if I stacked enough trophies on the shelf, my parents would have no choice but to finally see me. I pushed my body past every limit, running miles before dawn in freezing rain, studying until my vision blurred and my temples throbbed. I captained the varsity cross-country team. I placed first in the state science fair 2 years running. I maintained a flawless GPA while Janet was flunking out of her private prep school and maxing out credit cards at the mall. None of it registered. My father would glance at my report card and grunt. My mother would nod without looking up from whatever catalog she was browsing, already planning Janet's next birthday party. I wanted to be undeniable. I earned my official acceptance letter to the United States Naval Academy, a brutal achievement that required years of flawless dedication and a congressional nomination that I fought for entirely on my own. I brought the letter home, the heavy, embossed seal still warm from the envelope, and held it out to my mother in the center of the living room. She glanced at it. She set it aside on the coffee table without a single word of congratulation. Then she rushed across the room to praise Janet for buying a new limited edition designer handbag with our father's credit card. That cold indifference hit me like a fist to the sternum. I stood there holding the letter that represented my entire future, understanding for the first time that no amount of excellence would ever close the gap. I was an invisible ghost in my own home. That was the exact moment the need for their validation permanently died inside me. My sister's greed was never limited to material things. She ran a long-term psychological operation against my reputation with the patience and precision of a professional con artist. At every holiday dinner, every birthday party, every Sunday brunch with our aunts and uncles and cousins, she whispered calculated lies to the extended relatives, painting me as a cold, emotionless outcast who hated her own blood. She twisted my discipline into a story of arrogant hostility. I remember standing hidden in the darkened hallway during a Thanksgiving dinner, my jaw clenched so hard my teeth ached in their sockets. I listened in absolute silence as she played the tragic victim spinning a fabricated story about how I had verbally abused her over nothing. The relatives murmured in agreement, casting judgmental glances at my empty chair. I did not scream. I did not burst into the dining room to defend myself. I leaned my head back against the cold plaster wall and let the betrayal harden my spine into steel. Arguing with a master manipulator in front of her captive audience was a losing battle. Instead, I studied her tactics with cold detachment, analyzing how she weaponized fake vulnerability. I swore to myself that night that I would never allow another human being to use my own silence against me, ever again. I realized in that suffocating hallway that blood ties were nothing but a random biological accident, completely meaningless without a foundation of mutual respect. In the dead of night, while the entire house slept under their illusion of a happy family, I packed a single olive drab duffel bag. I folded my clothes with military precision, leaving behind everything my parents had ever bought me. I zipped the heavy canvas shut with a sharp, decisive yank, physically and emotionally, severing my dependence on their approval. I walked down the carpeted stairs and out the front door without a single backward glance. The freezing night air hit my face, and I felt an overwhelming rush of liberation. I was done being the designated victim in their twisted family drama. I was marching straight toward the military recruiting office to find a real family, one forged not by genetics, but by shared sacrifice, unbreakable honor, and genuine brotherhood. I did not shiver. I was leaving the pathetic, deceitful shadows of my childhood permanently in the dust, vowing never to return until I was completely unrecognizable. The military did not care about my feelings, my childhood traumas, or my sister's lies. I welcomed that brutal honesty with open arms. During the hellish weeks of basic training and medical officer school, the physical pain was relentless. My heavy combat boots sank deep into thick, freezing mud during 20-mile forced marches. With an 80-pound rucksack digging into my bruised shoulders, my legs screamed with every step. The drill instructors did not whisper sweet lies like my mother. They screamed the truth directly into my face from 2 inches away, and I loved every second of it. They told me I was weak, and I proved them wrong. They told me I would quit, and I outlasted every prediction. On the obstacle course, I tore the skin off both palms on a wet rope climb and kept going, leaving bloody handprints on the timber wall. The recruit behind me vomited and dropped out. I did not look back. But every single time my knees threatened to buckle, I pictured Janet's mocking smile from across that dining table. I bit down on my lower lip hard enough to draw blood, tasting the warm copper mixing with cold rain streaming down my face. I refused to show a single ounce of weakness. Each mile marched, each obstacle course conquered was a deliberate hammer blow forging my resilience. I was not just building a soldier's body. I was constructing a mental fortress where the manipulative tactics of my civilian family could never reach me again. When the physical exhaustion threatened to drop my defenses and bring back the ghosts of my childhood, I weaponized my own mind. 4 seconds inhaling cold air. 4 seconds holding it deep in my burning lungs. 4 seconds exhaling the pain. During a live trauma simulation drill in the second month, I froze. The screaming instructor slammed a metal tray against the wall 3 inches from my ear, and for 2 full seconds I was back at that dining table, 12 years old, watching my mother's eyes slide past me like I did not exist. The medic dummy bled out on the table in front of me. I failed the drill. That night, sitting alone on my bunk spine straight against the cinderblock wall, I made a decision. I was not going to compartmentalize the pain. I was going to burn it for fuel. I deleted the terrified, approval-seeking girl I used to be and overwrote her with the calculating, unbreakable operating system of a military intelligence and medical officer. I retook that drill the next morning and scored the highest mark in my class. Years of relentless grind slowly passed, turning my naivety into hardened combat readiness. I earned my advanced medical degree through sheer willpower, refusing anything less than perfection. I lost count of the sleepless nights spent in the surgical simulation lab practicing trauma procedures on synthetic tissue until my hands stopped shaking and my sutures were flawless under pressure. I watched other recruits wash out one by one, broken by the relentless standards. Some cried, some begged for reassignment. I just kept working. I graduated at the very top of my specialized class, choosing the grueling path of trauma surgery for forward deployed special operations units, the most dangerous medical posting the Navy could offer. Standing at attention on the sun-drenched parade deck in my crisp white Navy dress uniform, I held my breath as the heavy cold metal of the commander insignia was firmly pinned to my collar by a senior officer who looked at me with genuine earned respect. It was the first time in my entire existence that I felt truly recognized for my actual merits, rather than being compared to a phantom standard. The weight of that medal carried the immense responsibility of the lives I was sworn to protect. I did not need a father's empty praise or a mother's fleeting glance anymore. I had earned the unyielding respect of the United States Navy. That ceremony was not just a promotion. It was my official rebirth into a world where my actions finally spoke louder than any of my sister's lies. That evening, I stood alone before the smudged mirror in the officers' barracks locker room. The soft, yearning eyes of the desperate girl I once was were gone, replaced by the sharp, calculating gaze of a seasoned commander. I reached down and began to lace up my heavy desert combat boots, pulling the thick nylon laces tight with a violent, definitive yank. I was scheduled to deploy the very next morning. As I hoisted my gear onto my back, my personal phone buzzed once on the metal shelf. A voicemail from my mother. Her voice, thin and distant, talked about Janet's new apartment, Janet's new boyfriend, Janet's new life. Not a single word about my promotion. Not a single question about where I was going. I pressed delete before the message finished playing, dropped the phone into my footlocker, and locked it shut. I was marching into the fires of the most dangerous place on Earth, and I was entirely at peace. I had already survived the psychological warfare of my own home. The battlefield held nothing I had not already faced. 5 years ago. The Middle East. It was supposed to be a routine medical extraction. Our convoy had reached a small civilian compound on the outskirts of a contested village when the calm desert sky ripped open with the bone-rattling shriek of incoming mortar fire. The first explosion hit 30 yards to our left, lifting an armored vehicle off the ground and slamming it back down like a toy. I dove face first into a shallow, rocky trench, the sharp stones slicing through the fabric on my elbows. The afternoon heat burned the exposed skin on my face. The air grew thick with the choking sulfurous stench of ignited cordite and the heavy smell of fresh blood pooling in the dirt. Jagged shrapnel shredded the air inches above my Kevlar helmet, turning the quiet compound into a screaming kill zone. The volume of incoming fire was overwhelming, pinning our entire unit down and cutting off our escape route. Every second felt like an eternity as heavy machine gun fire tore through the mud brick walls around us. I gripped my medical kit, my heart hammering against my ribs, waiting for the exact tactical moment to move. Hesitation meant certain death for the men relying on my surgical precision in the middle of that chaos. Squinting through the swirling clouds of brown dust, I spotted 4 severely wounded men pinned in the center of the kill zone. Among them was a terrified, bleeding young scout named Michael Evans, a kid who had not even turned 21. I broke cover without hesitation. I dragged myself through jagged rocks and dirt, throwing my body over their exposed positions. I used my own Kevlar vest and flesh as a shield, absorbing the devastating crossfire aimed at their heads. The violent impact of heavy-caliber rounds hitting the dirt inches from my face vibrated through my bones. I screamed orders over the gunfire, frantically applying tourniquets and packing open chest wounds with gauze, while bullets snapped the air above my neck. I was not just a commander in that moment. I was their only lifeline. The sheer terror in Michael's wide eyes fueled my adrenaline past every human limit. I was willing to give every drop of my own blood if it meant these young men would get home to their families. That was the unbreakable bond of brotherhood under fire. A massive enemy round tore through the side of my tactical vest, shattering my lower ribs and knocking me backward into the blood-soaked sand. White-hot agony exploded deep in my chest, stealing the oxygen from my lungs, but I refused to stop. I gritted my teeth and kept crawling, leaving a dark trail of my own blood in the dirt. I pressed my trembling hands against the shredded uniform of Captain William Carter, our lead pilot. His injuries were catastrophic. He gripped the straps of my vest with desperate, terrifying strength, pulling me down toward his face. His features were covered in thick mud and his own blood as he choked out his final words. He looked directly into my eyes, piercing my soul, and whispered, "Save them, Amanda." The weight of that command from a dying brother eclipsed any pain from my own wound. It was a sacred contract sealed in blood. I watched the light fade from William Carter's eyes, his grip slowly loosening from my vest as he died right there in my arms, surrounded by the deafening roar of the firefight. I swallowed the scream building in my throat, violently suppressing my own grief, knowing I had to fulfill his final order before I allowed myself to collapse. Carter died in the sand, but his final order kept my heart beating. Ignoring the bullet lodged near my lung, I physically dragged Michael Evans and the remaining survivors out of the kill zone, one by one, crawling through the rocks and dirt with a collapsed lung and 3 shattered ribs. I loaded each man onto the ramp of the arriving medevac chopper, and the last thing I did before collapsing on the metal floor of the helicopter was reach back into the dirt and close William Carter's eyes with my bloody, trembling hand. Months later, after surviving multiple grueling surgeries and 3 months of agonizing rehabilitation, I found myself standing at attention inside a grand hall in Washington, D.C. The President of the United States stepped forward and carefully draped the heavy pale blue silk ribbon of the Medal of Honor around my neck. The cameras flashed. The audience erupted in thunderous applause, seeing a hero bathed in gold and national glory. But looking down at the gleaming 5-pointed golden star resting against my chest, I saw something different. It was a suffocating tombstone for Captain William Carter. It was woven from the threads of his sacrifice and stained with the invisible blood of my brothers. It was not decorative jewelry to be flaunted. It was a sacred, silent vow I carried every single day. This profound, bloody reality was exactly what my greedy sister and the corrupt judge were now trying to desecrate in that civilian courtroom, completely ignorant of the staggering human cost required to forge the metal they so casually insulted. The sudden jarring news of my father's death reached me through an official Red Cross message relayed to my commanding officer. Not a phone call from my mother. Not a text from my sister. A formal military notification, as if I were a stranger being informed of a distant acquaintance's passing. My own family could not be bothered to pick up a phone. A week later, after emergency leave was processed, I stood at the very back of the sprawling, dimly lit church, wearing my impeccable navy dress blacks. The pews were packed, with my father's business associates, country club friends, and local politicians all dressed in expensive black. Not a single one of them acknowledged my presence. I remained hidden in the shadows of the heavy oak doors, silently observing the theatrical display at the front altar. My sister, draped in an obnoxiously expensive black designer dress that looked more suited for a gala than a funeral, performed the role of the grieving daughter flawlessly. She threw herself dramatically over the polished casket, sobbing loudly, dabbing her perfectly dry eyes with a monogrammed silk tissue. Her performance was a masterclass in manipulation, masking the unadulterated greed radiating from her rigid posture. She was not mourning a father. She was impatiently mourning the legal delay before the reading of his will. Watching her accept condolences from my father's business partners, I felt my stomach churn with disgust. The genuine grief I had witnessed on the battlefield stood in horrifying contrast to this polished civilian charade. I crossed my arms over my chest, jaw set like granite, realizing with terrifying clarity that the real war was just beginning. My sister had already fired the first invisible shot. Later that evening, after the exhausting funeral reception ended and the last wealthy mourner had climbed into their imported sedan, I returned to the empty family estate to pack my limited belongings. I had no intention of staying longer than one night under this roof. The house was dead quiet, echoing with the ghosts of every argument, every ignored achievement, every slammed door from my childhood. I walked through the dim hallway, passing the wall of framed family photographs, where every single picture featured Janet. Not one photograph of me. Not even from my Naval Academy graduation. As I moved past the heavy double oak doors of my father's private study, I heard the distinct sound of hushed voices leaking through a narrow crack. My combat instincts flared instantly. I pressed my back flat against the cold hallway wall and nudged the door open a fraction of an inch. Inside, my grieving sister was intimately clinking crystal champagne glasses with Judge Walter Brown, the most corrupt magistrate in our entire county. They sat far too close on the leather sofa, laughing softly in the shadows, celebrating the impending division of our father's corporate assets. Walter's sweaty hand rested on Janet's knee, a physical confirmation of the sickening rumors about their secret affair. The audacity of their betrayal made my blood run ice cold. They were carving up a dead man's empire before his body was even cold. I did not burst into the room. I withdrew into the darkness of the hallway, analyzing their alliance with the cold precision of an intelligence officer, identifying a hostile target knowing that any impulsive action would compromise my strategic advantage. The trap snapped shut the very next morning with ruthless, calculated efficiency. I had barely stepped off the front porch when an aggressive process server in a wrinkled gray suit stepped out from behind the garden hedge and shoved a thick sealed manila envelope directly into my chest, hard enough to make me take a step backward. An emergency civil court summons filed before the sun had even come up. I ripped it open in the blinding morning light. My sister, guided by Walter's corrupt legal expertise, had filed a motion for total conservatorship backed by a forged medical signature from a doctor I had never met. The document claimed I suffered from violent, incurable post-traumatic stress disorder due to my combat deployments. It painted a fabricated picture of a deranged, mentally incompetent veteran entirely unfit to inherit or manage a single dime of the family estate. It was a legal assassination designed to strip me of all my rights and hand financial control directly to Janet. Reading those cold clinical lies on that heavy legal paper, I felt a surge of fury, unlike anything I had experienced in combat. They were not just trying to steal my money, they were weaponizing the trauma of my military service, using the sacred blood of my fallen comrades as a cheap tool for financial gain. I would never allow them to cross that line. I stood perfectly still in the driveway, holding the summons tightly. The paper crumpled slightly under my grip, but I did not scream. I did not pull out my phone to rage at my sister. I shut off every civilian emotion and engaged the icy composure of a Navy commander preparing for asymmetric warfare. I walked back into my childhood bedroom and pulled my pristine Navy dress uniform from its garment bag. I buttoned the stark white tunic with slow, deliberate precision, checking every thread in the full-length mirror. Then I reached into the velvet box on my nightstand and pinned the Medal of Honor to my chest, letting the heavy golden star rest over my heart. I ran my fingers over the pale blue silk ribbon, silently asking Captain Carter for strength. I checked the steel face of my watch. It was time. I grabbed my cover, tucked it sharply under my left arm, and stepped out the front door to face the slaughterhouse they had prepared for me. I intended to burn their corrupt empire to the ground with the one weapon they fundamentally lacked: unbreakable, irrefutable honor. I drove toward the county courthouse with a razor-sharp mind and zero fear. The deafening crack of the gavel hitting the sound block violently snapped my consciousness back to the present, yanking me out of the desert memories and plunging me into the claustrophobic reality of the courtroom. The transition was jarring, shifting from the wide-open terror of the Middle East to the heavily air-conditioned confines of the county courthouse. Judge Walter Brown sat high above me on his elevated leather chair, a living embodiment of the corrupt throne he had built for himself over decades of backroom deals and bought verdicts. His fleshy face was sweating under the harsh fluorescent lights, gleaming with greed. He glared down at me over the rims of his expensive reading glasses, treating a high-ranking, decorated military officer like a low-class delinquent who had wandered into his personal kingdom. The air conditioning hummed a steady drone, but the room itself felt suffocating, thick with coordinated corruption. I sat alone at the defendant's table, my spine perfectly straight. Walter shifted his massive weight, leaning forward to project his manufactured authority. He was engaging a hardened combat veteran who had stared down far worse monsters than a corrupt local magistrate in a cheap black robe. His smug confidence was sickening, but I refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. From the plaintiff's table across the aisle, my sister leaned forward aggressively. Her manicured fingers gripped the mahogany edge so tightly her knuckles turned white. She rolled her eyes with theatrical disgust, abandoning any pretense of sisterly concern. She spat her venom loud enough for the entire gallery and the court reporter to hear. "Sister, don't try to make it hard on the judge. You always like to wear those weird things to show off, to cover up the truth that you always neglected this family. Where were you when Dad died? You were busy with your crazy war games in some barren desert. This courtroom isn't a barracks for you to play hero. You're insane. You have no capacity to inherit anything." Every single word was a calculated poison dagger aimed at my deepest vulnerabilities. She was weaponizing my absence during our father's decline, twisting my military deployments into acts of selfish neglect. Her voice echoed off the wood-paneled walls, dripping with the arrogant certainty of someone who believes she has already won the war. She expected me to break down, to cry, to scream in defense, thereby validating her forged claim that I was mentally unstable. The courtroom held its breath, waiting for my reaction. I let her toxic words hang in the dead, freezing air. I did not rush to defend my classified deployments. I did not attempt to justify my absence to a room full of strangers. I adjusted my posture, sitting perfectly straight, aligning my spine like a steel rod. I let my cold, unblinking eyes lock onto her face, boring a silent hole through her fake confidence. My silence was not weakness. It was a devastating psychological weapon honed over years of interrogations. I watched with detached fascination as her smug smile slightly faltered under my dead-eyed stare. The longer I remained silent, the more the tension worked against her. The air grew thick, stifling her momentum. Janet shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting toward the judge for reassurance. She was realizing in those horrifying silent seconds that her petty civilian insults could not scratch the surface of the armor I forged in a combat zone. My refusal to play her hysterical game was slowly driving her insane. Having let Janet drown in the weight of my silence, I slowly turned my gaze away from my trembling sister. I fixed my eyes directly on the sweating judge. I did not raise my voice. I did not plead. I lowered my voice into a terrifyingly calm, resonant register that commanded the acoustics of the entire room. I looked straight through Walter Brown's corrupt soul and delivered my response. Your Honor, military regulations allow me to wear it. A single, perfectly constructed sentence. I was not asking for permission to exist. I was stating an undeniable federal fact that superseded his petty local jurisdiction. The immovable confidence in my tone drew an invisible iron boundary right down the center of his courtroom, daring him to cross it. My words did not just defend the Medal of Honor, they asserted the supremacy of the military uniform over his rigged proceedings. I could see the muscles in Walter's jaw twitching as his ego tried to process the fact that a defendant had just stripped him of his psychological dominance with 11 softly spoken words. I sat back, crossed my hands calmly on the table, and waited with the infinite patience of a trained predator for the corrupt magistrate to make his fatal, irreversible mistake. I knew it was coming. Men like Walter Brown always overplay their hand when they feel their authority is being challenged. My calm defiance acted as a lit match thrown into a powder keg, rupturing the judge's fragile ego. Walter Brown stood up abruptly, his massive frame knocking over a heavy stack of legal files that spilled across his desk. His face flushed a dark, dangerous purple, the veins in his neck bulging as he lost control of his judicial facade. He leaned over the bench, pointing a shaking finger at the golden star on my chest. He screamed, his voice cracking with unhinged rage. Military regulations have no value in my courtroom. I am the supreme authority here. My rules are absolute. We cannot let you walk into the sanctity of the law looking like that, wearing whatever cheap jewelry you want to show off. It is an insult to the strictness of this court. His saliva hit the small microphone, echoing with a sharp, ugly feedback whine through the speakers. He was blinded by his own narcissism, failing to realize that by calling the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration, for valor cheap jewelry, he had just crossed a massive, irreversible red line. He had publicly desecrated the blood of countless fallen American heroes. His ignorance of federal law was about to trigger an avalanche that would permanently bury him. The gallery gasped at his disrespect. I did not blink. Walter gripped his gavel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The veins in his thick neck pulsed visibly as he turned to the armed bailiff standing near the swinging doors. Every person in that gallery was holding their breath. The court reporter's fingers hovered frozen above her keyboard. Walter barked his order with spit flying from his lips. Guards, go down and strip that thing off her neck right now at all costs. Guard Thomas Wright, a burly middle-aged man in a county sheriff's uniform with 20 years of service patches on his sleeve, swallowed hard and approached my table with heavy, hesitant footsteps. He was visibly sweating, caught in an agonizing trap between a corrupt judge's direct order and his own deeply ingrained respect for the military uniform. As his large hand reached toward my collar, I did not flinch. I did not raise my hands to block him. I simply turned my head slowly and locked my cold, unblinking eyes onto his face. I projected the crushing weight of 1,000 bloody battlefields through my stare. I channeled the memory of Captain Carter's dying breath, forcing Thomas to look into the eyes of a commander who had walked through hell. I froze him instantly. His hand hovered in the air, trembling visibly under the immense silent pressure radiating from my stillness. He slowly lowered his hand and stepped backward, refusing the judge's command. He knew instinctively that ripping that ribbon from my neck would be an unforgivable sin. The room plunged into a breathless, terrifying silence as physical force was defeated by sheer unspoken discipline. Seeing his armed guard cower before a seated unarmed woman, Walter's humiliation transformed into blind, destructive fury. He smashed his gavel 3 times against the sound block, the deafening cracks echoing like gunshots. He roared his final rigged verdict, attempting to destroy my life with a single stroke of his pen. How arrogant, rebellious. If the guard can't do it because of your stubborn and violent resistance, then I will personally handle it with the law. As the presiding judge, I find you, Amanda Morris, guilty of contempt of court. I order you to be detained immediately. Furthermore, based on these crazy, rebellious acts, uncontrolled attitude, and your military history, I have enough legal basis and evidence to believe you are suffering from severe psychological trauma, an incurable form of PTSD. You are completely incapacitated to manage assets or make decisions for yourself. I declare the indefinite suspension of your inheritance rights and hand over full management and control of the Morris estate to the plaintiff, Ms. Janet Morris, the only sane person in this family. The audacity was breathtaking. He had weaponized a fabricated mental illness, bypassing every medical and legal protocol solely to execute a multi-million-dollar theft in broad daylight. He looked down at me with a triumphant sneer, believing his black robe granted him the power to overwrite reality. He thought the gavel was a magic wand. I remained seated, my face an unreadable mask, allowing him to dig his own grave as deep as possible. As Walter delivered his illegal sentence, my sister covered her mouth with her manicured hand, barely hiding a massive, wicked grin. She believed she had won. But neither she nor the judge noticed the quiet young man sitting at the transcription computer in the corner. Court Clerk Michael Evans, the very same terrified Navy scout I had pulled from the burning sand 5 years ago, slid out of his chair and dropped to the floor, hiding under his heavy wooden desk. Sweating and knowingly breaking every county security protocol, he pulled a smuggled, encrypted burner phone from his ankle holster. His hands shook violently as he dialed a classified naval command line he had memorized years ago. Cupping his hand over his mouth to muffle the sound, he whispered into the receiver. "Hello, Colonel Harrison. I am Evans. You need to hear this. They are insulting Commander Morris. A bastard judge is demanding to strip the commander's Medal of Honor and conspiring to strip her assets, slandering her as mentally ill." With those hushed, desperate words, Michael lit the fuse on a massive federal powder keg. While Walter and Janet gloated over their petty victory, they had no idea that the full terrifying might of the United States Navy had just been activated, and a reckoning of unimaginable proportions was already hurtling toward their corrupt little courtroom. Dozens of miles away, deep inside the fortified walls of the United States Naval Base, the secure red command phone rang in the operations center. Colonel Arthur Harrison, a hardened veteran who had spent 2 decades orchestrating rapid military responses across 3 continents, picked up the receiver with the calm efficiency of a man who had answered 1,000 crisis calls. He listened to the frantic whispered report from Michael Evans. The first sentence made him lean forward. The second sentence made his free hand curl into a fist. By the third sentence, his weathered face had hardened into an impenetrable mask of stone-cold fury. He dropped the receiver back onto the cradle with a sharp clatter that made his aide jump. Harrison did not pause to file a formal request or draft a preliminary memo. Protocol could wait. A decorated commander's honor could not. He sprinted from behind his desk, moving down the sterile, brightly lit corridor with the blistering speed of a combat deployment. His polished boots echoed against the linoleum, drawing the alarmed attention of junior officers who scrambled out of his path. He reached the heavy mahogany door leading to the Supreme Commander's office and shoved it open without knocking. He stepped into the massive flag-draped office and shattered the administrative calm of the room. He stood at rigid attention, breathing heavily, and shouted with absolute conviction, "Admiral, emergency." The gravity in Harrison's voice was unmistakable. It was the exact tone used when American lives are under fire, instantly transforming the quiet office into the nerve center of an active war zone. Every passing second allowed the corruption to further humiliate a national hero. Admiral Richard Sterling, the 58-year-old commander of the Pacific Fleet, was reviewing global fleet deployment logistics when Harrison burst in. The Admiral looked up with mild irritation at the violent interruption until Harrison delivered the full report. As the Admiral heard my name, a commander he had personally decorated and viewed with the profound respect reserved for a daughter, his pen snapped cleanly in half. Black ink bled across the white documents on his desk, completely ignored. His steely gray eyes flashed with a lethal glacial fury that seemed to drop the temperature in the office by 10 degrees. He stood slowly, a towering, physically imposing figure radiating terrifying authority. He did not negotiate with civilian corruption, and he did not tolerate the desecration of the military's highest honor. He issued a rapid-fire command that shook the foundation of the base. Whoever dares to insult my honorable soldier, activate the military police system immediately, notify the quick response force, prepare my car immediately. His voice was a low, rumbling thunder that allowed no debate or hesitation from any rank in the room. Within seconds, the entire base transitioned from peacetime operations to a full tactical alert. Sirens began to wail across the compound. Highly trained personnel sprinted toward the armory, their boots pounding the concrete in rapid succession. Phone lines lit up across 3 buildings as the chain of command cascaded Sterling's orders downward with terrifying efficiency. The Admiral grabbed his pristine white cover and placed it squarely on his head. His face, a terrifying portrait of righteous vengeance preparing to obliterate a petty tyrant. The military machine had been fully awakened by the arrogance of a local judge, and it was pivoting all its might toward one small, corrupt courtroom. Back in the suffocating courtroom, time slowed to an agonizing crawl. The fluorescent lights hummed a flat, dead drone above the gallery. The court reporter sat motionless, her fingers still frozen above her keyboard, too terrified to transcribe another word. The civilian spectators sat in rigid, uncomfortable silence, sensing that they were witnessing something profoundly wrong, but too intimidated by the judge's authority to intervene. Judge Walter Brown, completely oblivious to the massive military strike force mobilizing against him at that very moment, hovered his expensive gold-plated fountain pen over the final legal transfer documents. He took a long, slow breath, savoring the power he believed he wielded. He was one signature away from legally destroying my character, permanently branding me as mentally incompetent, and handing millions directly to my sister. Janet practically vibrated with greed in her leather chair. She clutched her designer purse so tightly her knuckles turned white, manicured nails digging into the soft leather. Her eyes were locked on the tip of the pen, waiting for the ink to dry, and my life to be permanently ruined. She shot me a quick, victorious sneer. I remained seated, breathing perfectly regulated. I was watching a tragedy unfold in slow motion, but I did not panic. I simply waited, trusting the unbreakable bond of the brotherhood I bled for, knowing that the longest, darkest shadows always appear right before the blinding light of an explosive dawn. They thought they had cornered a wounded animal. They had merely backed a highly trained predator into a corner. Walter lowered his hand. The gold nib pressed firmly against the crisp white paper of the final decree. But before the ink could form the first letter, the massive oak doors at the back of the courtroom exploded open with a thunderous crack. The force sent heavy wooden splinters flying against the plaster walls, shattering the suffocating tension. The entire gallery jumped out of their seats, gasping in terror, as Admiral Richard Sterling marched through the doorway. His immaculate white navy dress uniform reflected the harsh overhead lights, the 4 silver stars on his collar gleaming with undeniable authority. He was flanked by Colonel Harrison and a full, heavily armed squad of military police, wearing tactical gear, Kevlar vests, and carrying sidearms. Their synchronized combat boots hit the polished floor simultaneously, sounding like a steady, terrifying drumbeat of impending doom. The physical presence of the military overpowered the room, instantly sucking all the oxygen and the fake authority away from the corrupt judge. Walter's hand jerked violently, drawing a messy line of ink across his document. His mouth hung open in disbelief as he stared down the barrel of genuine, unstoppable federal power. The rigged game of civilian inheritance was terminated brutally, replaced by the terrifying reality of military justice crashing down with the weight of a collapsing mountain. Janet screamed, scrambling backward in her chair, finally realizing she could not manipulate her way out of the overwhelming force that had just breached the room. Admiral Sterling strode powerfully down the center aisle, his eyes fixed dead ahead with the unwavering precision of a man who had commanded aircraft carriers through hostile waters. He completely ignored the trembling judge hyperventilating on the bench, treating Walter Brown as nothing more than a minor irritating speck of dust on the windshield of actual justice. The military police fanned out behind him, taking strategic positions at every exit. No one was leaving this room without the Admiral's permission. Sterling marched straight toward my defense table, his 4 silver stars catching the fluorescent light with every step, commanding absolute silence from the terrified gallery. He stopped exactly 2 feet in front of me, forcefully clicked his polished heels together with a sharp, resonant crack, and snapped a perfectly rigid, slow, deeply respectful military salute. The ultimate display of honor, an irrefutable acknowledgement of my rank and my sacrifices delivered by one of the most powerful men in the armed forces. I immediately stood tall, pushing my chair back, raising my hand to return the salute with immense pride. That single, silent, synchronized gesture between 2 officers instantly shattered Walter's fabricated contempt of court charge, without either of us uttering a single syllable. The overwhelming display of mutual respect dismantled the narrative that I was a broken, unstable veteran. Standing there, bathed in the blinding reality of military solidarity, I watched from the corner of my eye as the last shreds of my sister's false confidence evaporated, leaving her exposed to the devastating fallout. The courtroom had been annexed by the fierce loyalty of the Navy. The corrupt judge was now the one on trial. Sterling turned sharply on his heel to face the stunned room, his posture radiating dominance that made the judge's fake authority look like a child playing dress-up. He slowly pulled a heavily embossed federal document from the inner pocket of his white coat. The presidential seal gleamed in gold leaf at the top of the thick, cream-colored paper. His voice, trained to command thousands of sailors across the Pacific, boomed like heavy artillery within the confined walls of the courthouse. He read my official heroic citation aloud to the silent crowd, detailing every horrific second of the blood in the sand, the heavy caliber fire my body absorbed, the bullet that shattered my ribs, and the 4 young lives I had pulled from the jaws of death with my own bleeding hands. He forced the sheltered, privileged civilian court to sit and listen to the brutal, agonizing reality of war. Every word he spoke acted as a burning slap across my sister's horrified face, stripping away her narrative that I was just playing crazy war games. The Admiral spoke of Captain Carter's sacrifice, his voice carrying the heavy, solemn weight of a nation's gratitude. He made it devastatingly clear that the golden star on my chest was purchased with the ultimate currency of human life. As the citation echoed through the room, members of the gallery lowered their heads in profound respect, turning their backs on Janet's petty lies. The magnitude of the truth suffocated the fabricated PTSD accusations, proving that my actions were born from supreme courage, not mental instability. Janet shrank further into her seat, physically crushed by the heroic reality she had so foolishly attempted to mock. Sterling carefully folded the citation and slid it back into his coat pocket. He slowly turned his head, finally locking his deadly gaze onto the sweating judge cowering on the high bench. Walter Brown was physically trembling, his expensive robes looking like a cheap costume. The Admiral delivered the legal kill shot with cold, surgical precision. And to enlighten your ultimate ignorance, Judge Brown ordering the confiscation or insulting the Medal of Honor is not a rule violation. It is a federal crime, a severe violation of the Hero Recognition Act. Using your power to suppress a military member fabricating a fake PTSD charge to seize assets is fraud and corruption at the worst level. You have angered the wrong person, Your Honor. The Admiral's words were not just an insult. They were a binding declaration of federal prosecution. He systematically listed the felonies Walter had committed in the last 20 minutes, completely bypassing the local jurisdiction Walter foolishly thought protected him. The heavy threat of a federal penitentiary hung suffocatingly in the air. The Admiral's voice left no room for debate, negotiation, or legal maneuvering. He had drawn an ironclad line in the sand, confirming that the military would use its resources to ensure Walter Brown never saw the inside of a courtroom again, except as a convicted felon. The certainty in Sterling's voice acted as an executioner's axe, swiftly severing Walter's corrupt career from its roots. The silence that followed was the sound of absolute victory for the truth. I watched the blood drain from my sister's face. It happened in stages like watching paint peel off a wall in slow motion. First, the color left her cheeks, then her lips went pale, then her entire complexion turned a sickly, translucent shade of gray. She shrank into her chair, her designer suit suddenly looking 2 sizes too big on her shrinking frame. Her eyes darted to the bench where Walter was supposed to be her invincible shield, and I watched the exact moment she realized he was gone. Up on the bench, Walter dropped his gold fountain pen. The metallic clatter echoed off every wall in the silent room. His fat, sweaty hands shook as he tried to grip the edge of his desk for support. He stammered incoherently, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water trying to form some kind of legal defense. But the military police were already stepping forward, hands resting on their tactical zip ties. 2 decades of backroom deals and bought verdicts crumbled in seconds. The gallery, the same gallery that had been swayed by Janet's theatrical tears just minutes ago, now stared at her with unmasked disgust. Women in the 3rd row were shaking their heads. An elderly man near the door muttered something under his breath and looked away. She was isolated. I watched their collapse with cold detachment, cataloging every physical detail of their destruction, the way I would document a hostile target's elimination. I felt no sympathy for the architects of my attempted destruction. As the military police swarmed the elevated bench to secure the judge, the sound of heavy boots and clinking handcuffs filled the room. I ignored the chaotic, satisfying destruction unfolding around me. I had one final piece of business. I turned away from the Admiral and walked directly to the plaintiff's table with slow, deliberate steps, my polished shoes clicking against the hardwood floor. I stopped inches from my trembling sister. I looked down at her terrified, tear-streaked face. The mascara was running in black rivers down her cheeks, staining the collar of her designer blouse. She was no longer the confident, arrogant socialite who mocked my military service and called my medal cheap jewelry. She was a broken, pathetic shell of a woman cornered by her own lies, and she knew it. I did not yell. I did not gloat. I leaned in close, lowering my voice so only she could hear the freezing finality of my judgment. I never needed that massive wealth, Janet. The thing I protect here is not money, but honor. People like you and Walter will never forever understand the meaning of sacrifice because your souls are too cheap and full of rot. Every syllable was a cold, calculated nail hammered into the coffin of our relationship. I looked into her eyes one last time, ensuring she understood she had lost not only the fortune she coveted, but the only sister who ever truly tolerated her. I delivered the final strike without shedding a single tear. I stepped back from the mahogany table, putting physical and emotional distance between myself and the wreckage of my bloodline. I straightened my white tunic, adjusted the Medal of Honor on my chest, and formally addressed the court reporter in a clear, commanding voice that carried to every corner of the room. I officially rejected the tainted family inheritance in its entirety. Every dollar, every property, every stock certificate my father left behind. I instructed the clerk to leave the massive estate frozen to be seized by federal investigators as direct evidence of Janet's sweeping fraud and conspiracy. It was the ultimate tactical maneuver. The millions she had schemed, lied, and seduced a judge to steal would now become the very bait that would send her to federal prison. I was leaving the money on the table like a live grenade with the pin pulled. Across the room, the military police forcefully slapped heavy black iron cuffs onto Walter's sweating wrists, physically dragging the disgraced judge away as he openly wept and begged pathetic apologies for his ruined career. My sister was left sitting alone at the plaintiff's table, sobbing in unadulterated terror. She had no lawyer, no corrupt judge to protect her, and no family left to manipulate. She was facing severe federal fraud charges, perjury, and conspiracy. I watched her break down for a few seconds, analyzing the complete destruction of the enemy before deciding she was no longer worth another second of my valuable time. The war was over. The villains had destroyed themselves. I did not look back to watch her cry. I had spent my entire childhood looking back, hoping for a sign that someone in that family cared. That girl was dead. The woman who replaced her did not waste time on lost causes. I turned sharply and fell into perfect synchronized step beside Admiral Sterling. Together we marched down the wide center aisle of the courtroom, our boots echoing in harmony, 2 officers walking out of a defeated enemy's territory. The stunned civilian gallery instantly parted in silent reverence, stepping back to allow the military to pass. Not a single person in that room dared to speak. The overwhelming aura of honor and justice had silenced every mouth. We stepped through the shattered, splintered remains of the heavy oak doors, leaving the suffocating stench of corruption lies and the miserable ghosts of my twisted bloodline behind me permanently. The oppressive atmosphere of the courthouse began to lift from my shoulders as I walked down the long marble corridor. The sound of Walter Brown's sobbing faded into the distance, replaced by the crisp, steady rhythm of my own confident footsteps. I had survived the worst the Middle East could throw at me, and I had now survived the most insidious psychological assassination my own family could engineer. I was walking away completely unscathed, leaving the battlefield victorious, having defended the sacred memory of my fallen brothers. The heavy burden of proving my worth to a family that never loved me was finally permanently lifted, replaced by the profound peace of complete self-acceptance. I was free. I pushed open the heavy glass doors and stepped out onto the wide, expansive marble steps of the county courthouse. The weight of the door felt like nothing compared to the weight I had been carrying for 38 years. The bright, warm morning sunlight washed over my pristine white uniform, instantly cutting through the lingering chill of the courtroom. The light caught the golden 5-pointed star of the Medal of Honor resting heavy on my chest, making it gleam against the navy blue silk ribbon. I stopped for a moment, closed my eyes, and took a long, deep breath of the free, crisp air. My family tried their hardest to bury me under a mountain of lies and legal paperwork, but they forgot that I was forged in the fire of combat. I survived the desert, and I survived them. I opened my eyes, looking out at the sprawling city before me, feeling a surge of profound gratitude. I was not a victim. I was a highly decorated survivor. I walked forward down the steps into my new life, leaving the shadows behind. I knew with absolute certainty that my honor, my integrity, and my hard-earned dignity remained completely untouchable, shining brighter than any inheritance ever could. As the Admiral's armored vehicle pulled up to the curb, I adjusted my cover and offered a final silent salute to the sky for William Carter. The war was won. The villains were vanquished. I stepped into the vehicle, ready to embrace the peaceful, limitless future I had fought so fiercely to protect. If you firmly believe that true honor and unyielding integrity will always defeat selfish greed, please like this video and subscribe to our channel today. Drop a comment sharing a moment when you had to permanently walk away from toxic relatives to protect your own hard-earned peace.